Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Students, hope so you all are good and fine. Well, in the previous video, I have actually given you the introduction of the cell cycle. Now, today we are going to learn about the series of the events which are going to take place in the cell cycle. Well, let's start. Students, I have explained you before that what is basically cell cycle. The cell cycle is the series of the event from the time a cell is produced until it completes mitosis and divide and produce new cells. This is basically the cell cycle. Well, if you're going to see that in detail, then basically the cell cycle, as I told you before, is the series of the events. Like many events are going to take place. Here, a one cell is present, which is going to pass through from series of the event like G1 phase, then move toward the S phase, then move toward the G2 phase, then prophase, pro-metaphase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and cytokinesis, and then it will produce the two cells. So this is the cell cycle. A cell after production of the cell, a cell used to pass through a series of the event, and after mitosis it is going to produce two cells, and this is known as the cell cycle. As I explained you before that 90% of the time will be taken by the interphase and only 10% will be taken by the mitotic phase. The 90% time will be taken by the interphase. The cell cycle have basically two major phases. The one is the interphase, and other one is basically the M phase, the mitotic phase. The interphase used to take 90% of the time, while the mitotic used to take 10% of the time. Basically, students, in the interphase, as I told you before, that interphase used to take the maximum time, the longest time. The reason is that in the interphase, the cell is basically in high metabolic phase. The cell is actually playing the high metabolic activities. The metabolic activities are high during the interphase. So that's why it used to actually in this phase, the cell's metabolic activity is very high. In that phase, the cell is basically duplicating the chromosome, duplicating the organelles, ribosomes, and producing the proteins and enzymes, which is going to required for the mitotic phase. Now students, we are going to learn step by step what is going to happen in each phase. What will happen in the G1 phase, what will happen in the S phase, and what will happen in the G2 phase. Well, basically in the G1 phase, the cell is going to produce the proteins, such type of the proteins and enzymes which is going to required for the S phase. The cells are going to produce such kind of the proteins and enzyme which is going to required for the S phase. Basically students, in G1 phase, what is happening? In G1 phase, the cell is going to increase its size, as well as cell will increase its growth. The cell is going to increase its size. As well as one more important thing is, student, the cell is also going to duplicate its organelles. Organelles like mitochondria and ribosome. So, what the thing the cell is doing? Cell is increasing its size, cell is increasing its growth, as well as cell is increasing the proteins. The cell is actually increasing the production of the protein which is going to required in the cell division, as well as it is also going to produce the cell G1 phase. In the G1 phase, the cell is also going to produce such type of the enzymes which is going to help in the S phase. Not only this, but cell is also going to duplicate its different types of the organelles. The cell is basically going to increase the number of the organelles, as well as it is also going to increase the number of the ribosomes. So students, we can read from here that in G1 phase, after its production, the cell starts its cell cycle. Beta, once a cell is going to produce, the cell is going to start its cycle that is known as a G1 phase. During this phase, the cell will increase its supply of protein, as well as it is going to increase the number of the organelles like mitochondria and the ribosomes, and it will grow in size, it will increase in size. This phase is also marked by the synthesis of the various enzymes, which is going to required for the next phase, that is the S phase. Well student, what is happening in the S phase? In the S phase, the cell is going to duplicate its number of the chromosome. As I told you before, the S means what? The S means synthesis. The S is the synthesis phase. In the synthesis phase, what is going to happen? The chromosome will going to double itself and will form a sister chromatin. Each chromosome that is going to present in the cell will double itself. Let's suppose this is the one chromosome and it is going to duplicate itself and will form the sister chromatin. The S phase is very important. In this phase, the chromosomes are going to double itself. And after S phase, the cell cycle is going to move towards the G2 phase. Well students, what is going to happen into the G2 phase? The G2 phase is also known as a gap 2 phase. In gap 2 phase, what is going to happen? The cell is going to produce such kind of the proteins or enzymes which is going to work or required by the mitotic phase. As well as the G2 phase is also going to produce a special proteins which is going to form the spindle fiber. Now the question is, what is basically the spindle fiber? If you remember, we have learned in detail about the microtubules and the tubulin protein in chapter number 4. These microtubules and tubulin proteins used to join with each other and used to form the long fibers which is required for the cell division. This is known as a spindle fiber. So, basically in G2 phase, the cell is on such type of the important proteins which is forming the spindle fiber, and which these proteins are. Yes, these proteins are microtubules and tubulin. The G2 phase is going to increase the number of the proteins, microtubule and tubulin, which is going to form the spindle fiber during cell division. What is the role of spindle fiber? This we are going to learn in next video, inshallah. Well students, you can see here, these are basically the spindle fibers, but the role we are going to learn soon in next video. Well students, we have learned about the main phases of the interphase. That's the G1 phase. The G1 phase is basically helping in the synthesis of the protein, as well as it used to duplicate the organelles, as well as the size of the cell used to increase in the G1 phase. After that, G1 phase will enter into the S phase, where the duplication of the chromosomes used to occur. After that, the cell will move toward the G2 phase, in which more growth of the cell is going to occur, as well as it is going to produce such kind of the proteins and the enzymes which is going to help in the mitosis in the cell division. Now, if you're going to look here more clearly, then there is one more phase that is known as a G0 phase, like G0 phase. Well, what is this G0 phase? Basically, this G0 phase is called the resting phase. This is known as a resting phase. Now, what do you mean by the rest? When the cell do not want to reproduce, it used to enter in this phase, and this is known as the G0 phase. After the G1 phase, if a cell do not want to reproduce, it will enter into the G0 phase, where the cell used to stop itself. It is not going to multiply itself, and this is known as the resting phase. Let's learn the G0 phase in detail. Students, the G0 phase is also called the non-dividing phase, in which the cells stop to differentiate. They do not reproduce. Well, students, there are two types of the G phases. One is the permanent. Other one is the semi-permanent. Also known as the temporary. So, permanent phase and temporary phase. In the permanent phase, the cell used to remain in the resting phase for whole life. The cell is going to produce once time in your whole life, and it's not going to reproduce again. The best example is the nerve cell. You might have seen the patient of paralysis around you. In Urdu, it is called falaj. You have seen that in paralysis what is happening. The nerve cells used to damage, and then after that their body never works. The reason is that the nerve cells never used to heal their self. Once they get damaged, they will remain damaged for whole life, because nerve cells never used to reproduce. They are in the G0 phase permanently. They never reproduce. But there are some cells who used to remain in the semi-permanent phase. These are like liver cells or kidney. They used to reproduce when it is required. Otherwise, they used to remain in the resting phase. But some cells are there which used to reproduce for whole time, and the best example is the epithelium cells. You're very well familiar of the epithelium cell. We have learned in the chapter number 4 and the types of the epithelium cells. Those cells which are basically present in your digestive tract, in the stomach, which are basically forming the lining. These cells used to die and these used to reproduce again. So these cells used to remain in the interphase and mitotic phase. Hope so you understand the lecture, and if you have any issue relevant to that, so please comment me, make the notes and send me the audio to make me sure that you have learned this. Stay blessed. Allah Hafiz. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.